Stephen Williams felt the warmth of James Morris pressed against his back, the steady rhythm of his roommate's breathing creating a gentle current of air against his neck. The darkness of his bedroom seemed to pulse with the weight of everything that had changed between them in just a few hours. James's arm was draped across his waist, fingers splayed against his chest, and Stephen could feel the other man's heartbeat through the thin fabric of his sleep shirt. This was not how he had imagined his Tuesday night would end when he had gone to bed alone 3 hours earlier. The nightmare had started it all. James had appeared in his doorway at 2:30 in the morning, silhouetted against the hallway light, his hair disheveled and his voice shaky as he whispered, "Stephen, I had the worst dream. Would it be okay if I slept in here tonight? I just don't want to be alone right now." Stephen had moved over without hesitation, lifting the covers and making space, his heart hammering against his ribs as James slipped into bed beside him. Now, as dawn approached and the first pale light began to filter through his curtains, Stephen wondered if this moment would change everything between them or if they would both pretend it never happened when morning came. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, how two straight roommates had ended up sharing a bed with an intimacy that felt like crossing an invisible line, you had to go back to the beginning of their living arrangement 6 months earlier. Stephen had been desperate for a roommate when his previous one moved out suddenly, leaving him with rent he could barely afford on his graduate student stipend. The apartment near campus was perfect, with 2 bedrooms and a living room that caught the afternoon sunlight, but the cost was becoming impossible to manage alone. He had posted on every roommate finder website he could find, growing more anxious with each passing day as his savings dwindled and responses remained few and far between. The stress had been keeping him awake at night, his mind cycling through worst-case scenarios of having to move back in with his parents or find some cramped studio apartment that would make finishing his thesis nearly impossible. Then James Morris had responded to his Craigslist ad. 25 years old, working in marketing for a local tech startup, clean, quiet, and according to his references, an ideal roommate. They had met at a coffee shop near campus, and Stephen had been immediately struck by James's easy confidence and warm smile. James was tall, with dark hair that always seemed perfectly tousled, and he had a way of making conversation that put Stephen at ease despite his usual social anxiety. When James had ordered a complicated drink with specific modifications and then apologized to the barista for being difficult, Stephen had found himself charmed by the consideration behind the gesture. "So you're working on a literature PhD," James had said, settling into the chair across from Stephen with his elaborate coffee creation. "That sounds incredibly challenging. What's your focus area?" Stephen had been surprised by the genuine interest in James's voice, so different from the polite but glazed expressions he usually encountered when people asked about his studies. Gray, 20th century American fiction, specifically looking at how economic anxiety manifests in post-war literature. "It's probably more boring than it sounds. Are you kidding?" "That sounds fascinating," James had replied, leaning forward slightly. "I mean, we're living through our own period of economic anxiety right now. There must be parallels you can draw, patterns that repeat across different generations." The conversation had continued in that vein for over an hour, James asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that showed he was genuinely listening. Stephen had found himself relaxing in ways he rarely did with new people, drawn in by James's combination of intelligence and warmth. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. The practical details had been sorted quickly. James could move in within the week. He had first month's rent plus deposit ready, and he seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the space when Stephen showed him around. But what had sealed the arrangement for Stephen was not the financial relief, though that was significant, but rather the way James had lingered in the living room, commenting on Stephen's books, and asking thoughtful questions about his graduate program in literature. There had been something in that first conversation that suggested they might actually become friends, rather than just two people sharing expenses. "I have to ask," James had said, running his finger along the spine of a worn copy of The Great Gatsby on Stephen's bookshelf, "do you actually enjoy reading these classics, or is it just academic obligation at this point?" Stephen had laughed, surprised by the directness of the question. "Honestly, both. Some days I feel like I'm dissecting something beautiful just to prove I understand how it works. But other days I'll read a passage that just stops me in my tracks, and I remember why I fell in love with literature in the first place. That makes sense, James had said, nodding thoughtfully. I imagine it's like being a professional musician. The technical knowledge probably enhances the experience sometimes and gets in the way other times. James had moved in on a Saturday in early September, arriving with a pickup truck full of furniture and boxes, along with two friends who helped him carry everything up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. Stephen had offered to help, but James had waved him off, insisting that he had imposed enough already. Instead, Stephen had made coffee and sandwiches, creating a small buffet on their kitchen counter for the moving crew. You didn't have to do this, James had said when he discovered Stephen's spread, but his smile had been warm and grateful. This is incredibly thoughtful. Well, it's the least I can do, Stephen had replied, pleased by James's reaction. Besides, I figured if I fed your friends well, they might be more careful with your furniture. The strategy had worked. James's friends, Mike and David, had been charming and careful, treating Stephen's space with respect and including him in their conversations as they worked. By the end of the day, Stephen had felt like he was gaining not just a roommate, but potentially a small social circle, something that had been missing from his graduate school experience. The first few weeks of living together had been marked by a careful politeness as they established routines and boundaries. James was indeed clean and quiet, but he was also unexpectedly social. Where Stephen tended to spend his evenings reading or working on his thesis, James often had friends over or went out to bars and restaurants around the city. He would always ask if Stephen wanted to join, extending invitations with a casual friendliness that never felt forced or obligatory. We're going to try that new Thai place on Fifth Street tonight, James would say, poking his head into Stephen's room, where he sat surrounded by books and papers. Want to come with us? I promise we won't talk about work the whole time. Stephen had declined most of these invitations initially, partly because he was genuinely busy with his coursework, but also because he felt intimidated by James's social circle. The few times he had met James's friends, they had seemed like the kind of people who moved through the world with an effortless confidence that Stephen envied, but could never quite manage himself. They worked in marketing and finance and consulting. They talked about weekend trips and expensive restaurants, and they all seemed to know exactly who they were and what they wanted from life. But James had been persistent in his friendship, and gradually Stephen had found himself drawn into conversations that stretched longer and grew more personal. James would knock on his bedroom door when he got home from work, asking about Stephen's day and genuinely listening to his responses. He remembered details about Stephen's classes and his thesis advisor, and he would ask follow-up questions that showed he was actually paying attention to Stephen's academic struggles and small victories. How did the meeting with Professor Martinez go today? James had asked one evening in October, settling onto the couch where Stephen was grading undergraduate papers. You seemed pretty nervous about it this morning. Stephen had looked up from the essay he was marking, surprised and touched that James had remembered. Better than I expected, actually. She had some good suggestions for restructuring my third chapter. I was worried she was going to tell me to start over completely. That's great, James had said, and his enthusiasm had seemed genuine. I know how hard you've been working on that chapter. You want to celebrate? I could open that bottle of wine you've been saving. It was gestures like these that had gradually broken down Stephen's reserve. James had a way of paying attention to the details of Stephen's life that made him feel seen and valued in ways he wasn't used to experiencing. When Stephen had been stressed about a conference presentation, James had helped him practice, offering feedback that was both supportive and genuinely useful. When Stephen had been sick with the flu, James had made soup and picked up medicine without being asked. The shift in their relationship had been gradual, so subtle that Stephen had not noticed it happening until he realized that James had become the person he most looked forward to seeing each day. It started with shared meals, James suggesting they cook together rather than eating separately, and evolved into long conversations over coffee in the morning and wine in the evening. James had a way of asking questions that drew Stephen out of his usual reserve, encouraging him to talk about his writing and his dreams in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Tell me about the book you want to write someday, James had said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. the two of them moving around the kitchen in the synchronized dance they had developed over weeks of cooking together. Not your dissertation, but the book that's just yours, the one you dream about when you're not thinking about academic requirements. Stephen had paused in his dishwashing, surprised by the question and the way James had phrased it, as if he simply assumed that Stephen had such dreams. How did you know I think about that? Because you light up differently when you talk about certain books, James had said, drying a plate with careful attention. There's this look you get, like you're seeing something the rest of us are missing. I figure someone who gets that excited about other people's stories must have stories of his own he wants to tell. The observation had been so accurate and so kindly expressed that Stephen had felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of defenses he hadn't realized he was maintaining. I do think about it, he had admitted. A novel maybe, about people trying to figure out who they are when all their assumptions about themselves turn out to be wrong. That sounds like something I'd want to read, James had said simply, and the matter-of-fact way he said it had made Stephen believe, for a moment, that such a book might actually be possible. By November, they had established a comfortable rhythm of domestic life that felt almost like a relationship, though Stephen tried not to think about it in those terms. They grocery shopped together, alternated cooking duties, and had developed inside jokes and shared references that made Stephen feel like he was part of something special. James would text him during the day with funny observations about his coworkers or links to articles he thought Stephen would find interesting. And Stephen found himself checking his phone constantly, hoping for these small connections. The texts had started as practical communications about household matters, but they had gradually become more personal and frequent. James would send Stephen photos of interesting things he encountered during his day, a particularly beautiful sunset from his office window, a dog wearing a ridiculous sweater, a bookstore display that reminded him of Stephen's research. Stephen had begun reciprocating, sharing pictures from campus and snippets of particularly absurd sentences from the undergraduate essays he graded. "Oh, thought you might enjoy this," James had texted one afternoon, along with a photo of a coffee shop chalkboard that read, "Unattended children will be given espresso and free puppies." Stephen had laughed out loud in the library, earning disapproving looks from other graduate students. But the moment of connection with James had been worth the embarrassment. These small exchanges had created a sense of continuity between them even when they were apart, a feeling that they were sharing their days in ways that felt intimate and precious. Stephen had begun to notice that his mood improved dramatically whenever his phone buzzed with a message from James, and he had started saving particularly funny or sweet texts, reading them over when he was feeling stressed or lonely. The first time Stephen had allowed himself to acknowledge his growing feelings had been on a Thursday evening in late November. James had been dating a woman named Carol Diaz for about 6 weeks, and Stephen had been trying very hard to be supportive and normal about it. Carol was beautiful and successful, working as a nurse at the local hospital, and she seemed to genuinely care about James. Stephen had met her several times when she came over for dinner or to watch movies, and she was unfailingly kind to him, always including him in conversations and asking about his studies. Stephen's working on this fascinating project about economic anxiety in literature, Carol had said during one of her visits, turning to him with genuine interest. "I was telling my coworkers about it, and they were so intrigued. The idea that you can trace societal fears through fiction is just brilliant." Stephen had been grateful for her interest, but he had also felt a complicated mix of emotions watching her interact so naturally with James, seeing the easy affection between them and wondering why he felt so unsettled by their obvious compatibility. But that Thursday night, James had come home from a date with Carol looking frustrated and deflated. He had slumped onto their couch next to Stephen, who had been grading undergraduate essays, and had let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken disappointment. Stephen had looked up from his papers, noting the tension in James's shoulders and the way he was running his hands through his hair, in a gesture Stephen had learned to recognize as a sign of stress or confusion. "Everything okay?" Stephen had asked, setting aside his grading and turning to give James his full attention. The red pen he had been using to mark errors rolled across the coffee table, coming to rest against a stack of papers covered in his careful corrections. James had been quiet for a moment, staring at the coffee table where Stephen's red pen lay next to a stack of paper covered in corrections. I don't know, he had finally said, his voice carrying a note of confusion that was unusual for someone who typically approached problems with such clarity. Carol is amazing, you know. She's smart and funny and beautiful, and she should be everything I want. But something feels off, like I'm going through the motions of dating her because I think I should want to be with her, not because I actually do. Stephen had felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, a mixture of hope and guilt that made it difficult to breathe normally. He had wanted to say something helpful, something that would comfort James without revealing his own complicated feelings, but the words had stuck in his throat. The admission had been so close to his own experience of dating women, the sense of performing attraction rather than feeling it naturally, that he had felt exposed even though James couldn't possibly know about his own struggles with his sexuality. What do you mean? Stephen had managed to ask, his voice carefully neutral, even as his pulse quickened. James had turned to look at him then, and Stephen had been struck by the vulnerability in his expression, the way James's usual confidence had given way to something more uncertain and searching. I keep waiting to feel that spark, you know? That thing everyone talks about when they describe being in love. But when I'm with her, I feel like I'm performing being her boyfriend rather than actually being her boyfriend. Does that make sense? It had made perfect sense to Stephen, who had spent most of his adult life feeling like he was performing heterosexuality rather than living it naturally. But he could not say that to James, could not reveal that he understood exactly what James meant because he had been questioning his own sexuality for months, largely because of his feelings for his roommate. Instead, Stephen had said, maybe you just need more time. Sometimes feelings develop slowly. The words had felt inadequate even as he spoke them, a generic response that didn't acknowledge the real confusion in James's voice. James had nodded, but Stephen could see that his response had not provided the reassurance James was looking for. They had sat in silence for a few minutes, the television playing quietly in the background, and Stephen had been acutely aware of the space between them on the couch, the way James's knee was just inches from his own. The silence had felt charged with unspoken thoughts, both of them seeming to wrestle with feelings they couldn't quite name or express. Can I ask you something? James had said suddenly, and Stephen had felt his pulse quicken at the serious tone in James's voice. Of course. Have you ever been in love? Really in love, where you felt like you couldn't breathe when the person walked into a room? Stephen had thought about lying, about giving some generic response about past relationships that had never quite reached that level of intensity. But something in James' expression had made him want to be honest, even if he could not be completely honest. The question had felt like an opening, a chance to share something real, even if he couldn't share everything. Once, Stephen had said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, there was someone I had feelings for, really strong feelings, but it was complicated. They didn't know how I felt. What happened? James had asked, leaning forward slightly as if he didn't want to miss any detail of Stephen's response. Nothing, Stephen had admitted, feeling the familiar ache of unspoken longing. I never told them. I was too scared of ruining what we had. James had studied his face for a moment, and Stephen had felt exposed under his gaze, as if James might somehow see through to the truth of his feelings. But James had only nodded and said, I think I understand that. Sometimes the risk feels too big. They had gone to bed shortly after that conversation, but Stephen had lain awake for hours thinking about the way James had looked at him, the careful attention he had paid to Stephen's words. There had been something in that moment that felt like a door opening, though Stephen had not been sure what lay on the other side. The conversation had felt like a turning point, a moment when they had both acknowledged that their understanding of themselves and their desires might be more complicated than they had previously believed. The next few weeks had brought a subtle shift in the dynamic between them. James had continued dating Carol, but he seemed less enthusiastic about it, and he had begun spending more evenings at home with Stephen. They had started watching a television series together, a British drama about complicated relationships and family secrets, and James had begun sitting closer to Stephen on the couch, their shoulders touching as they shared a bowl of popcorn or a bottle of wine. This show is incredibly well written, James had commented during one of their viewing sessions, reaching across Stephen to grab the remote from the side table. The movement had brought him close enough that Stephen could smell his cologne, something warm and woody that had become associated in Stephen's mind with comfort and home. The way they develop these relationships feels so authentic, like you're watching real people figure out their lives rather than characters hitting plot points. I love how they don't rush the emotional development. Stephen had agreed and hyper aware of the way James's shoulder was pressed against his own. They let the characters discover things about themselves gradually, the way it actually happens in real life. Stephen had been hyper aware of these small intimacies, the way James's hand would brush against his when they both reached for the remote, the way James would lean against him when he laughed at something on screen. It felt like they were moving towards something, though Stephen was afraid to name what that something might be. The physical closeness had seemed natural and unforced, but it had also felt charged with possibility in ways that made Stephen's heart race. James had also begun staying home more often when Carol suggested dates, making excuses about being tired or having work to catch up on. Stephen had noticed the change, but had tried not to read too much into it, telling himself that James was probably just going through a normal phase of relationship uncertainty. But he had also found himself hoping, despite his better judgment, that James's reluctance to spend time with Carol meant something more significant. Carol wanted to go to that new wine bar tonight, James had said one Friday evening, settling onto the couch next to Stephen with a sigh. But honestly, I'd rather just stay in with you and finish this series. Is that terrible of me? Not terrible at all, Stephen had replied, trying to keep his voice casual, even as his heart had leaped at James's choice. Sometimes staying in is exactly what you need. The breakthrough had come in early December, on a night when Carol had canceled their date because of a last-minute shift at the hospital. James had seemed relieved rather than disappointed, and he had suggested they order Chinese food and have a movie night. Stephen had agreed, grateful for any excuse to spend more time with James, and they had settled on the couch with containers of pad thai and spring rolls. You know what I love about nights like this? James had said, twirling noodles around his chopsticks with practiced ease. No pressure to be on or entertaining, just comfortable silence and good food. I know exactly what you mean, Stephen had replied, thinking about how different this felt from the few dates he had been in over the years, where he had always felt like he was performing a version of himself rather than simply existing naturally. Halfway through the movie, James had turned to Stephen and said, "Can I tell you something weird?" Stephen had muted the television and turned to face him, noting the nervous energy in James's posture, the way he was fidgeting with his chopsticks and avoiding eye contact. Always. I've been having these dreams lately, James had said, his voice careful and measured. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams that leave me feeling confused when I wake up. Dreams about being with someone who isn't Carol. Stephen had felt his heart begin to race, but he had kept his expression neutral, sensing that James needed space to work through whatever he was trying to say. What kind of dreams? Fine. James had looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the chopsticks he was holding. Us dreams about being close to someone, really close, in ways that feel more real than anything I experience when I'm awake. But the person in the dreams, it's not Carol. It's not even a woman. The words had hung in the air between them, and Stephen had felt the world shift slightly on its axis. He had wanted to say something, to offer comfort or understanding, but his throat had felt tight with the weight of his own secrets and the magnitude of what James seemed to be revealing. James had looked up at him then, his eyes searching Stephen's face with an intensity that made Stephen feel completely seen. Do you think that means something? Or am I just overthinking everything? Stephen had chosen his words carefully, aware that this conversation could change everything between them. I think dreams can sometimes show us things we're not ready to acknowledge when we're awake. They can be a way of exploring feelings that feel too scary to examine in daylight. James had nodded slowly, and Stephen had seen something like relief cross his features. Have you ever had dreams like that? Dreams that made you question things you thought you knew about yourself? Stephen had felt the moment balance on a knife's edge, the choice between honesty and safety presenting itself clearly. He had taken a breath and made his decision, knowing that this was a moment that would define not just their conversation, but potentially their entire relationship. Yes, Stephen had said quietly. I've had dreams like that. Dreams that made me realize I might not be as straight as I always assumed I was. James had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Stephen's face with an expression of surprise and something that might have been hope. Really? Really? I've been questioning my sexuality for a while now, actually. Trying to figure out why I've never felt that spark you were talking about with any of the women I've dated. They had sat in silence for a moment, the admission settling between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Stephen had felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, aware that he had just revealed something he had never said out loud to anyone. The vulnerability of the moment had been almost overwhelming, but it had also felt like the most honest he had ever been with another person. Who? James had asked softly, and Stephen had known he was asking about the person Stephen had mentioned having feelings for. Stephen had looked at James, taking in the careful attention in his expression, the way he was leaning slightly forward as if he did not want to miss a single word. It's you, Stephen had whispered. The person I mentioned having feelings for. It's you. The confession had opened a floodgate between them, and they had talked until nearly 3 in the morning, sharing fears and hopes and the small moments that had made each of them wonder if there might be something more than friendship growing between them. James had admitted that he had been thinking about Stephen constantly, that he had started looking forward to coming home not because of the apartment, but because Stephen would be there. Stephen had confessed that he had been jealous of Carol, not just because she got to be with James, but because she got to touch him casually, to kiss him, to be the recipient of his romantic attention. I kept telling myself I was just being a good friend, James had said, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of stress. But the truth is, I was looking for excuses to spend time with you instead of with her. I would make plans with Carol and then find myself wishing I was here with you instead. I felt terrible about being jealous, Stephen had admitted. You seemed happy with her, and I wanted you to be happy, but I also couldn't stand the thought of you falling in love with someone else. I think part of me knew, James had said thoughtfully. Not consciously, but somewhere deep down, I think I knew that what I felt for you was different from anything I'd ever experienced with a woman. I just didn't know how to make sense of it. They had not kissed that night, both of them seeming to understand instinctively that they needed time to process what had been revealed. But they had fallen asleep on the couch together, Stephen's head on James's shoulder and James's arm around his waist. And Stephen had woken up feeling more at peace than he had in months. The physical closeness had felt natural and right, a confirmation of the emotional intimacy they had just shared. The next few days had been a careful dance of new intimacy and old friendship. James had broken up with Carol, explaining honestly that he had realized he was not in the right headspace for a relationship with her. Carol had been understanding, even kind about it, telling James that she had sensed his distraction and hoped he would figure out whatever was troubling him. Well, she actually said she hoped I would find whatever it was I was looking for, James had told Stephen after the conversation with Carol. I think she knew on some level that my heart wasn't fully in our relationship. How do you feel about ending things with her? Stephen had asked, trying to gauge James's emotional state. Relieved mostly, James had said honestly, and guilty about feeling relieved. She deserves someone who was completely present in the relationship, and I wasn't able to be that person for her. Stephen and James had spent those days talking more openly than they ever had, exploring their feelings and what they might mean for their relationship. James had been surprisingly thoughtful about the implications of questioning his sexuality, reading articles, and asking Stephen questions about his own journey of self-discovery. Stephen had been amazed by James's openness, his willingness to examine assumptions he had held about himself for 25 years. I keep thinking about all the times I felt like I was performing masculinity rather than just being myself, James had said during one of their long conversations. Like I was following a script I'd memorized but never really understood. I know exactly what you mean, Stephen had replied. I always felt like there was something I was missing, some instruction manual for being a straight man that everyone else had received but me. The physical intimacy had developed gradually, naturally, in ways that felt both thrilling and comfortable. They had started holding hands while watching television, James's thumb tracing patterns on Stephen's knuckles. They had begun sitting closer together, their bodies touching from shoulder to hip as they shared meals or worked on their laptops. James had started playing with Stephen's hair while they talked, his fingers combing through the dark strands in a way that made Stephen feel cherished and desired. "Is this okay?" James had asked the first time he had reached out to touch Stephen's hair, his hand hovering uncertainly near Stephen's head. "More than okay," Stephen had replied, leaning into the touch. "It feels perfect." The first kiss had happened on a Friday evening, 2 weeks after their initial confession. They had been cooking dinner together, Stephen chopping vegetables while James stirred a sauce on the stove, when James had suddenly turned and cupped Stephen's face in his hands. "I want to kiss you," James had said, his voice soft but certain. "I've been wanting to kiss you for days, and I think I'm ready to stop being scared about it." Stephen had set down his knife and turned fully toward James, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I want that too." James had leaned in slowly, giving Stephen time to change his mind or pull away. But Stephen had remained still, his eyes fluttering closed as James's lips brushed against his own. The kiss had been gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. But as Stephen had responded, his hands coming up to rest on James's chest, the kiss had deepened, becoming more urgent and certain. When they had finally broken apart, both of them breathing heavily, James had rested his forehead against Stephen's and whispered, "That felt more right than anything I've ever done." Stephen had laughed softly, a sound of pure joy and relief. "I was just thinking the same thing." They had spent the evening kissing and talking, exploring this new dimension of their relationship with a mixture of excitement and wonder. James had been amazed by how natural it felt to be physically affectionate with Stephen, how right it seemed to hold him and touch him and be held in return. Stephen had felt like he was finally inhabiting his own life instead of watching it from the outside, finally experiencing the kind of connection he had read about in books, but never believed he would find for himself. The weeks that followed had been a period of intense discovery and deepening intimacy. James had thrown himself into understanding his sexuality with the same focused energy he brought to everything else in his life, reading books and articles, joining online forums, and talking openly with Stephen about his fears and revelations. Stephen had been moved by James's commitment to understanding not just his attraction to Stephen, but his identity as a person who was attracted to men. "I found this article about compulsory heterosexuality," James had said one evening, looking up from his laptop where he had been reading. "It's like someone wrote down everything I've been feeling for years but couldn't put into words." "That was one of the first things I read when I started questioning my sexuality," Stephen had replied. "It was such a relief to discover that other people had experienced that sense of going through the motions of heterosexuality without really feeling it. They had decided to take things slowly physically, both of them aware that they were navigating new territory and wanting to make sure they were making choices based on genuine desire rather than the excitement of discovery. But the emotional intimacy between them had deepened rapidly, and Stephen had found himself sharing thoughts and feelings with James that he had never shared with anyone. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," Stephen had confessed one night as they lay in bed together, fully clothed but holding each other close. "Like I was broken somehow because I couldn't feel what I was supposed to feel for women." "I had the same fear," James had replied, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on Stephen's back. "I thought maybe I was just too focused on work, or too picky, or not mature enough for serious relationships." James had been equally open, talking about his fears of disappointing his family, who had always assumed he would settle down with a woman and have children. He had worried about how his friends and coworkers would react, whether his identity as a straight man had been so central to how people saw him that changing it would feel like becoming a different person entirely. "My parents have been asking about Carol," James had said during one of their conversations. "They really liked her when I brought her home for Thanksgiving in the last year. I keep putting off telling them we broke up because I don't know how to explain why without getting into everything else." "You don't have to explain everything all at once," Stephen had reminded him gently. "You can take your time figuring out how much you want to share and when." Stephen had offered what comfort and perspective he could, sharing his own experiences of coming to terms with his sexuality and reminding James that he was still the same person he had always been, just with a more complete understanding of himself. They had spent hours talking about the future, about what it might look like to be together openly, about whether they wanted to tell people immediately or take time to settle into their relationship first. I keep thinking about coming out to my sister Lauren, James had said. We've always been close and I think she'd be supportive, but I'm also scared of how it might change things between us. What do you think she'd be most concerned about? Stephen had asked. Probably whether I'm happy, James had replied after thinking about it. Oi, she's always been more interested in my emotional well-being than in whether I'm following conventional expectations. The decision to sleep in the same bed had been James's suggestion, made one evening in late December as they were getting ready to go to their separate rooms. Stephen had been brushing his teeth when James had appeared in the bathroom doorway, looking uncertain but determined. Would it be weird if I asked to sleep in your room tonight? James had said. Not for anything specific, just because I want to be close to you. I like falling asleep with you when we doze off on the couch, and I keep thinking about what it would be like to wake up next to you. Stephen had rinsed his mouth and turned to face James, taking in the vulnerability in his expression. It wouldn't be weird. I've been thinking about the same thing. They had settled into Stephen's bed with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, both of them wearing sleep clothes and maintaining a careful distance at first. But as they had relaxed, they had moved closer together, James's arm coming around Stephen's waist and Stephen's head finding a comfortable spot on James's shoulder. This feels incredibly right, James had murmured into the darkness. It does, Stephen had agreed, already feeling drowsy and content in James's arms. Sleeping together had become their new normal, and Stephen had discovered that he loved the intimacy of sharing a bed with James, the way they would talk quietly in the darkness before falling asleep, the comfort of waking up in each other's arms. James had seemed to feel the same way, often reaching for Stephen even in his sleep, as if he needed the physical connection to feel settled and safe, which brought them to this particular Tuesday night when James had woken from a nightmare that had left him shaken and seeking comfort in a way that felt different from their usual bedtime routine. Stephen had been deeply asleep when James's voice had cut through his dreams, calling his name with an urgency that had brought him immediately awake. He had sat up in bed, disoriented and concerned, to find James standing in his doorway, looking pale and distressed. I'm sorry to wake you, James had said, his voice shaky. I had the worst nightmare and I need to not be alone right now. Can I sleep in here with you? Stephen had lifted the covers without hesitation, making space for James in the bed they had been sharing for the past 3 weeks. Of course, come here. James had slipped into bed beside him, and Stephen had immediately noticed that he was trembling slightly, his breathing uneven in a way that suggested he was still caught up in whatever he had dreamed. Do you want to talk about it? Stephen had asked softly, reaching out to take James's hand. James had been quiet for a moment, and Stephen had waited patiently, running his thumb over James's knuckles in what he hoped was a comforting rhythm. It was about losing you, James had finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. In the dream, we had some kind of fight, something terrible, and you left. You moved out and wouldn't talk to me, and I realized that I had ruined the best thing that had ever happened to me. I woke up and for a few seconds I thought it was real, that you were actually gone. Stephen had felt his heart clench at the pain in James's voice. He had pulled James closer, wrapping his arms around him and holding him tightly. I'm not going anywhere, Stephen had murmured against James's hair. Whatever we might fight about in the future, and we probably will fight sometimes because that's what people do, it won't be something that makes me leave. You're not going to lose me. James had relaxed slightly in his arms, but Stephen had been able to feel the tension still thrumming through his body. The nightmare had clearly affected him deeply, tapping into fears that Stephen suspected James had been carrying but not voicing. Are you scared about us? Stephen had asked gently. About what we're doing, what this relationship means. James had been quiet for so long that Stephen had wondered if he had fallen back asleep. But then James had shifted in his arms, turning so that they were facing each other in the darkness. Sometimes, James had admitted, not about my feelings for you. Those feel more real and right than anything I've ever experienced. But I'm scared about everything else, about how other people will react, about whether I'm strong enough to handle the judgment and questions that might come. I'm scared that I'll get overwhelmed and hurt you somehow, even though that's the last thing I would ever want to do. Stephen had reached up to cup James's face, his thumb brushing across his cheekbone. I'm scared sometimes too. This is all new for both of us, and there's no roadmap for how to do it perfectly. But I'd rather figure it out with you than be safe and lonely without you. James had leaned into his touch, and Stephen had felt some of the tension leave his body. I love you, James had said quietly. I know we haven't said that yet, but I do. I love you in a way that feels like coming home to myself. Stephen had felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of the declaration. I love you too. I think I've loved you for months without knowing how to name it. They had kissed then, soft and slow in the darkness, and Stephen had tasted the salt of tears on James's lips, though he was not sure if they were James's tears or his own. The kiss had been different from their previous kisses, deeper and more desperate, as if they were both trying to prove to themselves that this was real, that they were really here together. When they had broken apart, James had pressed his forehead against Stephen's and whispered, "Thank you for letting me come in here tonight. Thank you for making me feel safe." Stephen had kissed him again, briefly, and then had pulled him close, encouraging James to settle against his chest. In fact, always, Stephen had murmured. You never have to ask permission to come to me when you need comfort. James had relaxed fully then, his breathing evening out as the last of the nightmare's hold on him faded. Stephen had lain awake for a while longer, listening to the sound of James's breathing and thinking about the conversation they had just had. The vulnerability James had shown, his willingness to admit his fears while also declaring his love, had moved Stephen deeply. He had realized that what they were building together was not just a romantic relationship, but a foundation of trust and emotional intimacy that felt unprecedented in his life. The way James had come to him for comfort, the way he had been able to express his fears so honestly, spoke to a level of trust that Stephen had never experienced in any relationship. As dawn had begun to lighten the sky outside his bedroom window, Stephen had allowed himself to imagine their future together, the conversations they would have and the challenges they would face, and the quiet moments of domestic happiness that would sustain them through both. He had thought about the courage it would take for both of them to live openly as a couple, and the support they would need to find in each other and in whatever community they could build around themselves. But mostly he had thought about the profound gift of being trusted with someone's deepest fears and vulnerabilities, and the responsibility that came with that trust. James had chosen to come to him when he was scared and hurting, had chosen to share his most honest feelings about their relationship and his fears about the future. That choice felt sacred to Stephen, a recognition of the bond they had built and the safety they had created together. The morning had brought a new kind of intimacy as they had woken up tangled together, James's face buried in the curve of Stephen's neck, and Stephen's hand resting on the small of James's back. They had lain quietly for a few minutes, neither of them wanting to break the spell of closeness that the night had created. Eventually, James had lifted his head to look at Stephen, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his eyes still soft with sleep. "Good morning," he had said, his voice rough and warm. "Good morning," Stephen had replied, reaching up to smooth down James's unruly hair. "How did you sleep after the nightmare?" "Like a baby," James had said, smiling. "I think being close to you made all the difference. I felt completely safe." They had made breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen with an easy familiarity that had developed over months of shared meals. But there had been something different in the way they touched each other that morning, more deliberate and affectionate, as if the previous night's conversation had given them permission to be more openly loving. James had wrapped his arms around Stephen's waist while Stephen scrambled eggs, pressing a kiss to the back of his neck that had made Stephen shiver with pleasure. Stephen had fed James bites of toast while they waited for coffee to brew, laughing at the way James had exaggerated his appreciation for each morsel. "You're ridiculous," Stephen had said, but his tone had been fond and indulgent. "Ridiculously in love with you," James had replied, stealing another bite of toast from Stephen's fingers. Over breakfast, they had talked about their plans for the day, the ordinary details of work and errands and evening activities. But underneath the mundane conversation had been an undercurrent of new understanding, a recognition that they had crossed another threshold in their relationship and emerged stronger and more connected. "I want to tell my sister about us," James had said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup and looking at Stephen with a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Lauren has always been supportive of me, and I think she'll be happy that I've found someone who makes me feel the way you do. But I wanted to check with you first. Make sure you're comfortable with me sharing our relationship with my family." Stephen had felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of James's family knowing about them, but it had been overwhelmed by a sense of pride and happiness that James wanted to include him in that part of his life. "I would love for you to tell Lauren about us," Stephen had said. "I know how close you two are, and I want you to be able to share this with the people who matter to you." James had reached across the table to take Stephen's hand, squeezing it gently. "What about your family? Are you ready to tell them, or do you want to wait?" Stephen had considered the question, thinking about his parents and his younger brother, all of whom lived several states away and with whom he maintained a cordial but not particularly close relationship. His family had always been somewhat emotionally distant, focused on academic achievement and intellectual pursuits rather than personal relationships and feelings. "I think I want to wait a little longer," Stephen had said honestly. "Not because I'm ashamed of us, but because I want to feel more settled in my own understanding of my sexuality before I try to explain it to them. They're not particularly progressive people, and I think it will be easier for everyone if I'm completely confident in who I am before I have that conversation." James had nodded understandingly. "That makes perfect sense. There's no rush on any of this. We can take our time and tell people when it feels right for each of us." They had spent the rest of the morning in comfortable domesticity, Stephen working on his thesis while James caught up on emails from his office. But they had remained physically close, James working from the couch with his laptop while Stephen sat in the armchair nearby, their feet touching as they each focused on their respective tasks. Around noon, James had closed his laptop and suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood, pointing out that they had both been inside all morning and could use some fresh air and exercise. Stephen had agreed, grateful for the excuse to spend more time with James and curious about how it would feel to be out in public together now that their relationship had evolved. "I love how we can just exist together," James had said as they prepared to leave the apartment. "Even when we're both working on different things, there's this sense of companionship that I've never experienced before." "I know exactly what you mean," Stephen had replied, pulling on his jacket. "It's like we're creating our own little world together." The walk had been revelatory in small ways. James had taken Stephen's hand as they strolled through the tree-lined streets near their apartment, their fingers intertwined in a way that felt both natural and thrilling. Stephen had been hyper-aware of the public nature of their affection, wondering if anyone they passed would notice or care that two men were walking hand in hand. But as they had walked, Stephen had realized that most people were absorbed in their own lives and concerns, and those who did notice them seemed either indifferent or, in a few cases, quietly approving. An elderly woman walking her dog had smiled at them warmly, and a young couple with a baby had nodded in a friendly way as they passed. "You seem more relaxed now," James had observed after they had been walking for about 10 minutes. "I was nervous at first," Stephen had admitted, "about being affectionate in public, about what people might think. But you're right, most people don't seem to care, and the ones who do notice seem friendly about it." James had squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I think we live in a pretty accepting neighborhood, but even if we didn't, I wouldn't want to hide how I feel about you." They had stopped at a small park a few blocks from their apartment, settling on a bench that overlooked a playground where several children were playing while their parents watched from nearby benches. James had put his arm around Stephen's shoulders and Stephen had leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. "I keep thinking about what you said last night," James had said, his voice thoughtful, "about being willing to figure this out together rather than being safe and lonely. I think that might be the bravest thing anyone has ever said to me." Stephen had turned to look at him, surprised by the emotion in James's voice. "It didn't feel brave when I said it. It just felt true. I think that's what made it brave," James had replied. "You were willing to choose love even when you couldn't guarantee how it would turn out." They had sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play and the parents chat with each other. Stephen had found himself imagining what it might be like if they were to have children someday. whether through adoption or surrogacy, and the thought had not frightened him the way similar thoughts about future relationships had in the past. "Can I ask you something?" Stephen had said eventually. "Always. Do you think about the future? About what our life might look like in a year or 5 years?" James had been quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I do think about it, probably more than I should given how new this relationship is. But when I imagine my future now, you're always in it. I can't picture a version of my life that doesn't include you." Stephen had felt his heart do that complicated thing again, the mixture of joy and disbelief that still accompanied moments when James expressed his feelings so directly. "What do you see when you imagine our future?" Stephen had asked. James had smiled, his eyes taking on a dreamy quality. "I see us in a house somewhere, maybe not too far from here because I know you love this city. I see us having dinner parties with friends, traveling together, supporting each other through whatever challenges come up. I see us growing old together, becoming one of those couples who finish each other's sentences and have inside jokes that no one else understands." Stephen had been moved by the specificity of James's vision, the way he had clearly spent time thinking about the details of a shared life. "That sounds perfect," Stephen had said softly. "All of it." They had walked home hand in hand, stopping to pick up groceries for dinner and talking about their plans for the evening. James had suggested they cook something special to celebrate what felt like a new chapter in their relationship, and Stephen had agreed, looking forward to another evening of the domestic intimacy that had become so precious to him. "What should we celebrate exactly?" Stephen had asked as they browsed the produce section of their local grocery store. "Everything," James had replied, selecting a bunch of fresh herbs with careful attention. "The fact that we found each other, that we were brave enough to be honest about our feelings, that we're building something beautiful together." "I like that," Stephen had said, adding items to their basket. Celebrating everything. The evening had unfolded with the kind of easy pleasure that Stephen was learning to associate with their relationship. They had cooked together, James handling the main course while Stephen prepared a salad and opened a bottle of wine. They had eaten by candlelight, not because it was a special occasion, but because James had suggested that they deserved to make an ordinary Tuesday evening feel celebratory. "This feels like something out of a movie," Stephen had said, looking across the table at James in the flickering candlelight. "Ja boimo." The kind of scene where two people realize they're falling in love. "Except we already know we're in love," James had replied, raising his wine glass in a small toast. "This is the scene where they realize they're going to make it work." Over dinner, they had talked about James's plan to call his sister Lauren the next day, discussing what he might say and how much detail he wanted to share. Stephen had offered to be nearby during the call for moral support, and James had accepted gratefully, admitting that he was nervous about the conversation, even though he expected Lauren to be supportive. "I think I'll start by telling her about you as a person," James had said, twirling pasta around his fork thoughtfully. "About how we became friends and how that friendship developed into something deeper. I want her to understand that this isn't just about my sexuality changing, but about finding someone who makes me feel complete." "That sounds like a good approach," Stephen had agreed. "Well, you can always share more details later if she has questions." They had also talked about Stephen's thesis, which was entering its final phase, and James had asked thoughtful questions about Stephen's research and his plans for defending his work in the spring. Stephen had been struck, as he often was, by James's genuine interest in his academic work and his ability to ask questions that helped Stephen think through complex ideas. "I've been thinking about your novel idea too," James had said as they cleared the dinner dishes. "So, the one about people discovering their assumptions about themselves are wrong. I think you should seriously consider writing it after you finish your dissertation." "You really think so?" Stephen had asked, touched by James's encouragement. "I know so," James had replied firmly. "You have something important to say about identity and self-discovery, and I think a lot of people would benefit from reading your perspective on it." After dinner, they had settled on the couch to watch television, but they had ended up talking instead, the conversation meandering through topics both serious and lighthearted. James had told Stephen about his childhood, sharing stories about growing up with Lauren and their parents in a small town in Ohio. Stephen had reciprocated with his stories about his own upbringing, the academic household where books were treasured and intellectual achievement was the highest value. My parents always expected me to become a professor, Stephen had said, curled against James's side on the couch. I don't think they ever considered that I might want something different, or that academic success might not be enough to make me happy. What do you think would make you happy? James had asked, his fingers combing gently through Stephen's hair. This, Stephen had replied without hesitation. Being with you, having someone to share my life with who actually sees me and loves me for who I am. The academic stuff is important to me, but it's not everything anymore. As the evening had progressed, they had moved closer together on the couch, their bodies naturally seeking contact and comfort. James had begun playing with Stephen's hair again, his fingers combing through the dark strands in a way that made Stephen feel drowsy and content. I love this, James had said quietly, his hands stilling in Stephen's hair. What specifically? Stephen had asked, though he thought he knew what James meant. This feeling of being completely comfortable with another person. I've never had this before, this sense that I can be completely myself without worrying about being judged or misunderstood. Stephen had turned to face him more fully, taking in the soft expression on James's face. I know exactly what you mean. I feel like I can breathe more easily when I'm with you, like I don't have to work so hard to be acceptable. James had leaned down to kiss him then, a slow, sweet kiss that had tasted like the wine they had shared with dinner. When they had broken apart, James had rested his forehead against Stephen's and whispered, I'm so grateful that you answered my text about the apartment. I can't imagine what my life would be like if we had never met. Stephen had felt tears prick at his eyes again, overwhelmed by the tenderness in James's voice and the recognition of how easily they might have missed each other entirely. I'm grateful too, Stephen had whispered back. For all of it, even the scary parts. They had gone to bed together that night with a sense of anticipation and contentment, both of them aware that they were building something precious and worth protecting. As they had settled into Stephen's bed, James had pulled Stephen close and murmured, Thank you for making me feel so loved. Stephen had kissed his forehead and replied, Thank you for loving me back. They had fallen asleep wrapped around each other, and Stephen had slept more peacefully than he had in months. His dreams filled with images of the future James had described, a life of shared meals and quiet conversations, and the deep satisfaction of being truly known by another person. The nightmare that had woken James in the early hours of Wednesday morning had been a jarring interruption to that peace, but it had also provided an opportunity for them to reassure each other of their commitment and to speak words of love that had been building between them for weeks. Now, as Stephen lay in the growing light of dawn with James's warm body pressed against his back, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, when he had been desperately searching for a roommate, he could never have imagined that he would find not just financial relief, but the love of his life. The progression of their relationship felt both miraculous and inevitable to Stephen, as if all the small moments and conversations had been leading them toward this recognition of their love for each other. He thought about the first time James had asked about his novel idea, the way James had listened to his fears about academic pressure, the countless small kindnesses that had built trust between them long before either of them had acknowledged their romantic feelings. James stirred behind him, his arm tightening around Stephen's waist as he began to wake up. Stephen remained still, not wanting to disturb James's transition from sleep to wakefulness, but also savoring this moment of quiet intimacy before the day began. Good morning, James murmured against Stephen's neck, his voice rough with sleep. Good morning, Stephen replied softly. How did you sleep? Perfectly, James said, pressing a gentle kiss to Stephen's shoulder. No more nightmares, just dreams about you. Stephen turned in James's arms so that they were facing each other, taking in James's tousled hair and the soft expression in his eyes. What kind of dreams? James smiled, his hand coming up to cup Stephen's cheek. Dreams about our future, about all the mornings we'll wake up like this. Dreams about growing old with you and never taking for granted how lucky I am to have found you. Stephen leaned into James's touch, feeling his heart swell with love and contentment. I love you, he said simply. I love you too, James replied, and then he kissed Stephen gently, a kiss that tasted like promises and new beginnings. As they lay there in the early morning light, Stephen thought about the conversation they would have with Lauren later that day, about the other conversations that would follow as they gradually shared their relationship with the important people in their lives. He thought about the challenges they might face and the support they would need to find, but mostly he thought about the profound rightness of being here with James, of having found the person who made him feel completely himself. The nightmare that had brought James to his bed in the middle of the night had been about losing each other. But Stephen knew now that what they had built together was stronger than fear. They had found each other against all odds, had been brave enough to acknowledge their feelings, and honest enough to build a relationship based on genuine intimacy and trust. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that knowledge filled Stephen with a peace and confidence he had never experienced before. He had found his person, and his person had found him, and everything else would work itself out in time. As James drifted back to sleep in his arms, Stephen allowed himself to imagine the life they were building together, the ordinary moments and extraordinary joys that awaited them. He thought about the house James had described, about dinner parties with friends who would love them both, about quiet evenings spent reading together and exciting adventures in new places. But mostly he thought about this, about the simple miracle of waking up next to the person you love and knowing that they love you back with the same fierce tenderness that makes everything else possible. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, that begin with practical arrangements and grow into something that transforms your understanding of what it means to be fully alive. Stephen closed his eyes and allowed himself to fall back asleep, secure in the knowledge that when he woke again, James would still be there, and they would have another day to continue building the life they had discovered they both wanted. The nightmare was over and the dream was just beginning.